The Concord bowl came down the table like a verdict, hand to hand, and every hand found a way not to touch the primes. Wren Kessler stood at her post along the east wall of the long hall, stylus in hand, counting seats the way she counted everything, quietly, exactly, without looking like she was doing it. 2 chairs flanked Prime Ythera at the head of the table. Both were empty. The velvet runner across them hadn't so much as wrinkled. 40 places down the table, Vyark nobles passed the bronze bowl from claw to claw, dipped their fingers into the grain paste inside, ate, and passed it on, murmuring the old words that weren't really words anymore, just breath shaped into ritual. When the bowl reached the seat 2 down from the prime, the noble holding it, a broad-shouldered warden named Ussa Dornvel, did not lean across the empty chairs to offer it to Ythera at all. She passed it directly across the gap, to the noble on the far side, as if the 2 empty seats were a wall and not an insult. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. The long table's oldest law didn't require speech. The bowl was the speech. Wren logged it anyway because that was her job's second long table this cycle, flanking seats vacant. Bowl did not cross to the prime. She hesitated over the last line, then wrote it exactly as she'd been trained to write it, flat and clean, no opinion in the ink, oath not renewed. At the head of the table, Prime Ythera sat with her hands folded on the cloth in front of her, spine straight as a mast, and did not reach for the bowl that would never reach her. The collar of ridged plates along her throat and collarbone, the chorus collar, every Vyark had one, though Wren had only ever seen the bonded ones glow, sat matte and colorless under the hall's cold light, like a lamp with the wick pulled out. Wren had asked Akafar once what color a living chorus collar was supposed to be. Akafar had said, gold usually, sometimes blue for grief bonds, never gray. Gray means the light went out on one side and nobody relit it. The bowl finished its circuit 40 places later, back in the hands of the ritual keeper, and the hall exhaled that specific Vyark sound, air pushed through throat plates instead of lungs, a sound like a held door easing shut. Chairs scraped. The long table was over. Nobody had eaten from the prime's hand, and the prime had not eaten at all. Wren closed her log and did not look up as the nobles filed past her post toward the doors, because she had learned in 3 weeks on this station that looking up too long at a Vyark noble walking away from an empty chair got you a look back that made you feel like you'd been caught stealing. "Second table," said a voice at her shoulder. Chief Archivist Wren Akafar had a way of appearing without footsteps, a skill Wren suspected came from 40 years of human diplomatic postings where footsteps got people killed. Akafar's gray hair was cropped short under the deputation's plain blue collar pin, and her eyes were doing the same count Wren's had just finished. Second, out of the 3 the law allows her. What happens after the third? After the third consecutive long table with no seat filled beside her, the severance tribunal convenes and votes her out of the Concord by default. Akafar said it the way she said everything that mattered evenly, like a supply manifest. No war needed, no coup needed. Just 3 empty chairs and a room too frightened, or too willing to fill them. Wren watched the last of the nobles clear the doors, all but one. A tall, silver-plated Vyark elder lingered near the threshold, watching Ythera the way a man watches a house he intends to buy once the current owner is finally, properly, gone. His own chorus collar burned a deep, healthy gold. Wren had learned his name in her first week, because everyone on Ilveth Anchorage had learned his name in their first week. "Marshal Thren Ilo," she said. "Don't stare," Akafar said, not unkindly, and steered her toward the archive wing by the elbow. They walked past the long viewport that ran the spine of the anchorage, stars wheeling slow and silent beyond it, and past the burn-scarred section of hull plating the station had never bothered to resurface. A reminder, left up on purpose, that Ilveth had been fought over twice in the last decade before the current, fragile peace made it neutral ground instead. Wren had read the treaty archive her first week here, cover to cover, the way she read everything. The Human Coalition had been granted a standing deputation on the anchorage not out of Vyark generosity, but out of Vyark exhaustion. Two exhausted powers agreeing that a third, smaller, less armed species might make a useful witness neither side trusted the other to be. It was not a glamorous mandate. It came with a records office nobody senior wanted, and a budget line item that got questioned every quarter. It had, so far, kept the peace holding by threads thin enough that Wren had learned to feel every one of them tighten. This was the second table, Wren said, half to herself, half to Akaffer, working the number over like a stone in her pocket. There was a first one. Before I logged for it myself, I only saw the record. 19 days ago, Akaffer said. You were still on cargo intake rotation. The first table, half the hall didn't even understand yet what the empty seats meant. Some of the younger nobles genuinely thought it was mourning custom, giving her space. It was Marshal Ilo, by every account I could piece together afterward, who made sure the second table understood exactly what silence was supposed to cost. She glanced sideways at Wren. You weren't assigned to court proceedings, you know. You logged the first one because the junior clerk assigned to it came down with something station medical never quite named, and you were the only apprentice free that shift. Lucky me. I didn't say lucky, Akaffer said. I said assigned. There's a difference, and I'd like you to remember it exists, because I think you're about to forget it on purpose. The archive wing of Ilveth Anchorage smelled like ozone and old paper substitute. A smell Wren had come to like more than she'd expected to, when the deputation program shipped her out here 8 months ago. An orphan with good hands and a flat, patient mind, assigned to catalog the debris of other people's disasters, because nobody thought a 16-year-old apprentice needed to be anywhere more important. She had grown up in a coalition relief dormitory on a world she barely remembered leaving, raised by rotating shifts of caseworkers who were kind in the efficient, professional way of people managing 40 children at once, and she had learned early that the surest way to be given something to do, a task, a post, a reason to exist in a room, was to be quietly, thoroughly competent at something nobody else wanted. Cataloging was that thing. It didn't require charm. It didn't require a family to vouch for her, or a name anyone recognized, or the particular fearless confidence that got louder children noticed and promoted. It only required her to look at a thing closely enough, long enough, that its true shape stopped hiding from her. She was good at it. She had never, until this cycle, thought of it as a skill that might matter to anyone but a filing system. Most of what came through her intake queue now was Devor salvage. The Devor collapse had happened 4 months before Wren ever set foot on the anchorage, but its wreckage was still arriving in irregular shipments. Crates of scorched personal effects, corrupted data cores, half a mining rig's worth of instrumentation nobody back home wanted and nobody here could bear to throw away. Her job was to sort it, tag it, and file it somewhere it would never be looked at again. She was 3 crates into the day's intake when Akaffer set down a 4th one, heavier than the rest, its seal still bearing the black mining guild stamp of the Devor lattice station. Late manifest, Akaffer said. Somebody in cargo finally cleared it for release. 4 months sitting in a hold because nobody wanted to be the one who cataloged a dead station's last shift. Wren cracked the seal. Inside, 3 personal recorders cracked and dark, a fused control yoke, a stack of hard copy shift logs, edges burned black, and wedged at the bottom, a smaller case marked with a single engineer's serial number instead of a name, the kind of tag issued to contract crew whose families hadn't been found yet to be told. She logged it. Recorder damaged, unresponsive. Recorder damaged, unresponsive. She got to the 3rd one and it clicked when she turned it over, not dead, just locked, its casing intact under the scorching. That'll need the engineering shop to open, Akaffer said, glancing at the clock built into the wall. Not today. We're due at the second briefing in 10 minutes and I would like for once to not be late in front of Marshal Ilo. Wren set the recorder in the queue for repair and followed her out, and told herself she wasn't thinking about it, and thought about it the whole way down the corridor. The station's ritual keeper had an office 3 doors down from the archive wing, a coincidence of station architecture that Wren had exploited before, mostly for questions too small to bother Akaffer with. Elder Mawson, old even by Vyark standards, his collar a deep, banked blue gone soft at the edges like a coal that had been burning a very long time, kept the long table's law texts in physical form, stacked in a room that smelled of the same fixative resin the ritual bowl itself was cured in. "You're the human who's been asking after severance precedent," he said, without looking up from the scroll he was respooling, when she found an excuse to stand in his doorway. "Word travels fast in a records office. We're not so different from you that way." "I wanted to know if it's ever not happened," Wren said. "A third table, ever." Mawson was quiet long enough that she thought he might simply not answer. Then he set the scroll down. "Once," he said, 411 cycles ago. A prime named Corvath, unchorused by plague rather than catastrophe, an outbreak that took 11 of the ruling caste inside a single season, including her bondmate. Her court avoided her for the same reasons this one avoids Ythera. Fear of the hollow note, mostly honest fear, in a season when everyone's collar organ was already strained by grief. On the morning of the third table, a station physician, Vyark, bonded, fully capable of feeling every part of the ache, walked the length of the hall and sat down beside her anyway, and told the assembled court that he had made his peace with the pain a long time before he made his peace with watching a colleague be discarded by a law that punished her for surviving. What happened to him? He never fully recovered his collar's clarity. The hollow note leaves a residue in a bonded Vyark who stands close to it too long. It's not permanent damage, usually, but it can be if the exposure is severe enough or repeated enough. He knew that going in. He sat anyway. Mawson's own collar pulsed slow, something that might have been the Vyark equivalent of a sigh. History remembers him fondly and remembers almost nothing else about him, not his name past the one act, not what he did with the rest of his life. I have always found that a little unjust. A man became a single gesture in the record and nothing more. "Maybe the gesture was the point," Wren said. "Maybe," Mawson agreed. "Or maybe the record simply never bothered to ask him what came after, because the record, like the law, is more interested in the moment a debt gets paid than in the person who pays it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his ancient, banked blue collar flickered, almost curious. "Why do you ask, clerk? You have no chorus to wound. Whatever keeps you from that chair, it isn't the ache." Wren didn't have a good answer for him yet, so she gave him the honest one instead. "I don't know yet. I just wanted to know it was possible before I decided anything." "It was possible once," Mawson said, 411 cycles ago, at the cost of one man's collar and most of his name. I'd think carefully before I called that a comfort. But he pulled a second scroll from the shelf as she turned to go, the full text of the severance law, not the summary posted for public reading, and held it out to her without being asked. "Take it anyway. If you're going to think carefully, think with the actual law in your hands, not the version Marshal Ilo has spent 6 days convincing this station is the only one that exists." The second briefing was the kind of meeting where nothing was decided, and everything was decided anyway. 14 Vyark officials and 3 humans from the deputation sat around a low steel table in a room with windows that looked out on nothing but stars and the long gray flank of a docked relief cruiser. Marshal Wren Ilo sat closest to the head, though the head chair, reserved always for the prime, was empty. Ythera had not come. "The human deputation's continued presence on Ilvath anchorage," Ilo said, in the smooth, unhurried voice of a man who had never once in his long life needed to raise it, "was authorized under the previous Concord's treaty terms. Those terms are, as of this cycle, under review pending the resolution of the succession question." "There is no succession question," said Akaffer. Prime Ythera holds the Concord seat. Prime Ythera holds half of a seat meant for two, Ilo said. A prime unglamorous cannot lawfully rule the Concord alone past the third severance. It is not cruelty to say so. It is the law that has governed this system for 600 cycles, and it exists for good reason. A chorus is not sentiment, archivist. It is how two minds check one another before either commits a fleet, a treasury, a station full of lives, to a decision made in grief. She survived a catastrophe that killed her conquered partner, Kessler said. That is not disqualifying, that is a tragedy. It is also, said Ilo, mild as ever, unexplained. He let that sit in the room like a held breath. Prime Doskai died at the Devor Lattice station along with 211 contract workers. Prime Ythera did not. No formal account of the collapse has ever been given by her or by anyone because our custom forbids a prime from testifying to her own conquered partner's death. The grief seal exists to spare her that unbearable telling, and I have honored it, as everyone in this room has honored it. But silence, however kindly meant, leaves room for a story to grow in the dark. And it has grown. Wren, seated at the back with her log open on her knee, watched the room take that in, watched two junior officials exchange a glance that wasn't quite an accusation, but wasn't quite not one either. "You're suggesting she let him die," said the third human deputy, a logistics officer named Calder, bluntly, because humans on this station had a habit of saying the thing everyone else circled. "I am suggesting nothing," Ilo said, mild as ever, though something in the mildness had sharpened. "I am reporting what the room has already decided without my help. Ask any noble at that table why the flanking seats stood empty, Officer Calder, and not one of them will name me. They will name their own collars. They will name their own fear. I have simply had the discipline not to contradict them." A junior official near the foot of the table, a slight, younger Wren recognized from the archive's supply manifests as an aide attached to Warden Ussa Dornville's household, cleared his throat with the particular hesitance of someone about to say something he would rather not have to. "Marshal, with respect, the warden herself has said, privately, that she believes the shunning has gone further than the hollow note alone justifies. That some of it is." "Is what?" Ilo said, and did not raise his voice and did not need to. The aide's collar guttered amber and he did not finish the sentence. "The warden is entitled to her private beliefs. I would remind her household, through you, that private beliefs voiced publicly at a long table carry public consequences, for her standing, and for anyone whose fortunes are bound to hers. I say this not as a threat. I say it as the same courtesy I extended the human deputation. Everyone in this room benefits from understanding the shape of the ground they're standing on before they take a step." The aide said nothing further. Wren, watching from the back of the room, understood she had just seen, in 9 polite sentences, exactly how a 600-cycle-old law got enforced without a single vote being taken or a single hand being raised. "My candidate, Aspirant Kaeldorn, stands ready to take the second seat of the Concord should the tribunal find it vacant. That is not ambition, archivist, that is stewardship." He inclined his silver head precisely to the humans. "Your deputation's status will follow the Concord's. I would advise patience, and I would advise, gently, staying well clear of a succession that is not yours to referee." Wren wrote none of that down. It wasn't the kind of thing that belonged in a log. But she carried it out of the room with her anyway, the way you carry a stone in your shoe, and she carried the aide's guttering collar with it too, proof, small and specific, that the fear in that hall had a source with a face and a title, not just a biology no one could argue with. Calder caught her afterward in the corridor outside the briefing room, walking fast to fall into step beside her, his deputation jacket still buttoned wrong at the collar from a morning that had clearly started before he was ready for it. "You've got a look," he said. "I've been doing coalition postings for 11 years, Kessler, and I know that look. It's the look of somebody deciding to do something they've already been told not to." I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Calder didn't push it further, which surprised her more than if he had. I'll tell you something Akaffer won't, because she's your supervisor and I'm not, so I've got more room to be blunt. This deputation isn't just an archive posting for 3 bored humans babysitting a records office nobody wants. It's the last working proof this coalition has that the Vyark and the wider human systems can share a station without shooting at each other. If Ilo gets what he wants, if Ythera goes down over 3 empty chairs and Kaeldorn takes the second seat, the first thing his faction does is revisit every treaty clause the previous Concord signed while distracted by a war footing, and our deputation's mandate is one of the softest clauses in that whole stack. We're not soldiers. We're not cargo. We're the easiest thing on this station to cut when a new government wants to prove it's serious about renegotiating. So the safe thing is to do nothing, Wren said, and hope the Concord that wins doesn't feel like renegotiating anyway. The safe thing, Calder agreed, is exactly that. I'm not telling you it's the right thing. I've watched enough postings collapse to know safe and right aren't always the same animal. He glanced sideways at her, and something in his face, tired, coalition-worn, older than his years in the particular way of people who had buried colleagues in postings that were supposed to be quiet, softened. I had a partner once, on a station not unlike this one, who used to say the job wasn't to keep the peace. It was to keep the peace honest. I never fully understood what she meant by that until about an hour ago, watching Ilo work a room without once raising his voice. What happened to her? She kept the peace honest one time too many, Calder said, on a posting that didn't have a tribunal willing to hear evidence when it mattered. I'm not going to tell you that story today, Kessler. I'm telling you this one instead. Whatever you're about to do, do it with your eyes open, and know that if it costs the deputation, some of us will still think it was worth doing. That's not permission. I don't have the rank to give you permission. It's just company for whatever that's worth, on the way to a decision you've clearly already made. He peeled off toward the cargo levels without waiting for an answer, and Wren stood in the corridor a moment longer than she needed to, turning the word honest over like she'd turned the number 6 over 3 days before. The evening after Calder left her standing in the corridor, Wren went back to the archive office to close out the day's intake, and found the checkout ledger for the 4th Devor crate open on the desk exactly where she'd left it that morning, except the ledger's last line wasn't hers. Someone had signed for the burned shift logs, not requested them through the proper intake queue, the way any deputation staff or Vyark official was required to, but signed the physical ledger directly, in a cramped, unfamiliar hand, time-stamped 2 hours into a shift when the archive wing's outer door should have been locked and the reading room dark. The logs themselves were still in the drawer where she'd filed them. As far as she could tell on a quick count, nothing missing, nothing visibly disturbed. But the ledger line sat there like a fingerprint left deliberately on a doorknob, proof that someone had wanted to know exactly what she had before she'd finished piecing it together herself, and hadn't much cared whether she noticed the visit. She brought the ledger to Akaffer's office, rather than sit with it alone. Akaffer turned it under the desk lamp for a long moment, tracing the unfamiliar signature with one finger without quite touching the page, the way she handled anything she suspected might later need to be examined by someone more official than either of them. Archive access outside your intake queue requires a supervisor's countersign, she said finally. This isn't forged, Wren. It's real clearance, used by someone who didn't want their own name legible on it, which is a different problem than someone breaking in. Ilo doesn't do his own signing. That's the entire art of the man. I've watched him work 3 postings now, and I have never once seen him touch a thing with his own hand that a subordinate could touch for him instead. If his fingerprints show up anywhere, it will be on the outcome, never on the paperwork. Akaffer closed the ledger and sat back, and for the first time since Wren had known her, she looked less like a diplomat weighing an acceptable risk, and more like a woman doing arithmetic she didn't care for the answer to. Whoever this was, they didn't take anything. They looked, which tells us one of two things. Either they didn't find what they were afraid you had and they're still hunting for it. Or they found it, read it, and decided the safer move was to let you keep building your case in the open and discredit it publicly at the table, rather than make you disappear quietly 3 days before a tribunal vote and hand your cause a martyr instead of a clerk. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be, Akafar said. It was meant to tell you the 6 days you think you have may be shorter than they look on the ritual keeper's schedule. Move the recorder repair up. Tonight, if this sin will do it. And don't leave anything with your name on the request queue sitting in a drawer a moment longer than it has to. She took the ledger with her when Wren left, locked it in her own desk instead, and said nothing further about it. But Wren noticed, walking out, that Akafar checked the corridor both directions before letting the door seal behind them. A small habitual caution Wren had never seen her use before that evening, and would see her use every evening afterward, all the way to the third table. Wren didn't sleep well that night, for a different reason than the one that would keep her up 2 nights later. She lay in the narrow bunk of the deputation's crew quarters running the ledger signature over in her mind, the specific cramped slant of the unfamiliar hand, the 2-hour gap between lock and visit, the fact that nothing had been taken, and thought about the pink-collared woman from the cargo bay, and the courtier's collar flaring white in the corridor, and understood, with real weight for the first time instead of abstract conviction, that she was no longer the only person on this station who thought the recorder mattered. Somebody else had already decided that too. She just didn't yet know whether that made her safer or considerably less safe, and she fell asleep before she could finish deciding. The fourth thing happened to her directly, 2 days later, and she didn't tell Akafar about it until the ledger conversation was already old news, which she would recognize afterward as the first genuinely reckless decision she made in the whole affair. She came back to her quarters on the crew deck one evening to find her belongings undisturbed in every way that mattered and subtly wrong in every way that didn't. Her spare uniform jacket hung 2 fingers' width to the left of where she always hung it. The stylus case on her narrow desk sat closed instead of open, the way she never left it. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. It was the kind of disturbance a person left when they wanted to be found out, not when they wanted to stay hidden. A signature as legible, in its own way, as the unreadable one in the archive ledger, except this one had been written directly across the small, private space where Wren slept. She stood in the doorway a long moment, naming the feeling in her chest as honestly as she could manage. Not fear exactly, or not only fear. Something colder and more useful, the particular clarity of a person understanding, all at once, that the shape of the threat against her was never going to be a blade in a corridor. It was going to be exactly this. A jacket hung wrong. A ledger signed by a hand nobody could read. Small, precise proofs that she was seen, offered without a single word spoken aloud, so that if she ever tried to report them, there would be nothing on record to report. She was still standing there when the corridor's night patrol came around. A station security officer named Tallies, human, coalition contracted rather than deputation staff. Someone Wren knew only well enough to nod to in a mess hall. Tallies clocked her face before she'd said a word. "Somebody been in your quarters," Tallies said. "It wasn't a question. I've walked this corridor 11 years, Kessler. I know that look too. Nothing's missing." That's usually the point. Tallies stepped inside without being asked, glanced once around the small room, and didn't touch anything either, moving with the same careful economy Akafar had used on the ledger. "I can't log an incident with nothing taken, and no forced entry station security's charter doesn't stretch that far, and you know as well as I do whose household would get asked about a formal complaint before anyone got around to asking mine." She turned back to Wren, and something in her weathered, off-duty face softened into an offer that had nothing official behind it at all. "But I walk this corridor every night shift for the next 2 weeks, whether anyone logs anything or not." If you want your door watched a little closer than the standard rotation, that's not a favor I need permission to give. Costs the coalition nothing. Costs me nothing but a few extra passes I was already walking. Why? Tallies considered the question longer than Wren expected. Because I've spent 11 years on postings where the official channels were always 6 steps behind the people actually doing something worth watching, she said finally. And because my sister worked contract crew on a station not unlike this one, on a shift that got the short end of an evacuation once. Nobody sat with her. I wasn't in a position to change that when it mattered. I am, apparently, in a position to walk a corridor a little slower for a clerk who's trying to change it for somebody else. She didn't wait for thanks, only nodded once, precise as a Vire courtesy, and went back to her rounds. Wren didn't report the disturbance to Akaffer for 2 more days. She did, however, start sleeping with the second copy of the recording somewhere other than her own quarters, and she noticed, without ever being told to notice it, that Tallies's rounds did in fact slow, every night after that, exactly the length of a corridor and a doorway, all the way through to the morning of the 3rd table. The 3rd long table, the last one the law allowed before the tribunal convened by default, was 6 days out. Wren learned the exact number from the ritual keeper's posted schedule, because she'd started checking it the way some people checked the weather. In the 5 days between, she watched 3 things happen, and none of them made her feel better. The first was public, and it happened in the cargo bay where the deputation's relief shipments came through. 3 decks below the long hall's polished quiet, where the Human Coalition and the Vyerk Resettlement Office jointly processed the steady, unglamorous trickle of DVOR survivors still arriving from temporary shelters further out in the system. Wren was down there collecting an intake crate when a woman, Vyerk, middle-aged by the species reckoning, her collar the raw, unhealed pink of someone whose own bond had been severed in the collapse, and had not yet settled into any steady color at all, recognized the deputation pin on Wren's collar, and crossed the bay to plant herself directly in front of her. "You're the clerk who logs the tables," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Word again traveled fast. "I lost my daughter at DVOR. Contract crew, lower decks, the section that never got a shuttle at all because the Prime's guard detail spent their evacuation minutes dragging their own ruler to safety instead of clearing my daughter's berth." Her collar flickered, raw and unsteady. "I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because everyone talking about Ythera in that hall talks about her grief like it's the only grief that happened at DVOR. It wasn't. Whatever you think you're doing, clerk, remember there were 211 people on that station who didn't have a guard detail assigned to carry them anywhere." Wren didn't have an answer for her, not then, and didn't try to manufacture one. "I'm sorry about your daughter," she said, which was true and entirely insufficient, and the woman's collar didn't soften at it, and Wren let her walk away without following, because there was nothing in her that believed a stranger's grief owed her a resolution just because Wren happened to be standing nearby with a log in her hand. She thought about the woman for the rest of the day. She thought about her again longer, when she finally understood what the recording actually contained, because the woman wasn't wrong that a guard detail's 2 minutes belonged to somebody. She was only wrong about whose choice it had been to spend them that way, and Wren understood, turning that over, that clearing Ythera of blame for one thing did not erase every hard question DVOR had left behind. It only answered the one question the tribunal had actually been convened to ask. The second was small and almost happened to nobody. She was crossing the mid-deck promenade with a crate of tagged DVOR effects when she saw Warden Usadorn Vel, the same broad-shouldered noble who'd passed the bowl straight across the gap at the last table, standing near the Prime's private garden alcove, 3 steps closer to the entrance than idle traffic explained. Ythera was inside, alone, tending a bed of pale flowering vine that didn't belong to any world Wren recognized. The warden's collar pulsed once, uncertain, and then Marshal Ilo's aide rounded the corridor bend behind her, said nothing, only slowed, only looked, and the warden's collar dimmed back to a careful, unreadable amber, and she turned and walked the other way. Wren didn't understand the whole shape of it. She understood enough. And she understood, too, why the warden's aide had cleared his throat so carefully in that briefing. A household already being watched, already weighing what one bad step near the wrong garden might cost a family with fortunes bound to a warden's standing. The third thing she saw up close in a crowded supply corridor, 2 days later, when a young courtier misjudged the crowd and staggered too near Ythera as the prime passed through on her way to a private audience. The courtier didn't fall, but her hands flew to her own collar, claws digging at the plates, and she made a sound low in her throat that wasn't performance. Wren had seen enough performed deference on this station by now to know the difference. It was pain, real and involuntary, gone as fast as it came, and the courtier's collar flickered a raw, ugly white for 3 full seconds before settling. Wren caught her elbow before she could stumble into the wall, more reflex than decision, and held her upright until the worst of it passed. Up close, the courtier looked barely older than Wren herself, a junior attendant, by the plain cut of her sash, the kind of court rank that existed mostly to carry messages and stand in the right place at the right time. "I'm all right," the courtier said, too fast, straightening out of Wren's grip with the particular embarrassment of someone caught being weaker than her rank required. Her collar was still cycling down from white to a raw, tender amber. "It passes. It always passes." "Does it happen every time she walks past, or just when you're not braced for it?" The courtier looked at her, surprised, the way people were surprised when a stranger asked a real question instead of offering a platitude. "Just when I'm not braced," she admitted. "If I see her coming, I can angle myself, hold my breath, brace the collar plates flat. It's the ones I don't see coming that put me on the floor." She hesitated, glancing once down the corridor where Ythera's retinue had already turned a corner out of sight, then back at Wren. "You're the clerk, the one asking after Devor telemetry." "Word travels." "Word travels," the courtier agreed, and something crossed her young face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite fear either. Something more like the specific, tired hope of a person who had spent 6 days flinching from a pain that was real being asked, for the first time, whether the flinching and the politics were actually the same thing. "For what it's worth, clerk, some of us brace for the ache because it's real. Not all of us stopped filling the seats because Marshal told us to. But I won't pretend the two reasons haven't gotten tangled up in each other this cycle. It's hard to tell some mornings which one I'm actually afraid of." She didn't offer her name, and Wren didn't ask for it, and they went their separate ways down the corridor. But Wren carried that exchange with her too, filed it next to the aide's guttering collar and the pink-collared mother from the cargo bay. Another small true thing in a station full of people trying to sort real pain from manufactured fear, and not always managing to tell the difference even in themselves. She did not seek out Warden Ussa Dornvell on purpose. It happened the way most of the important things on Ilvath Anchorage seemed to happen to her that cycle, sideways, in a corridor, because the station was small enough that avoiding someone took more effort than running into them. The warden was standing outside the small chapel deck, where the quarterly memorial would be held in 2 days' time, inspecting the seating arrangement with the flat, dutiful attention of someone doing a task she'd rather not be doing, when Wren came through with a crate of tagged effects bound for the display wall's archive. Ussa's collar cycled amber the moment she registered who was crossing the room, and for a breath Wren thought she might simply turn and leave rather than be caught standing near the clerk. Everyone on the station had started associating with trouble. She didn't leave. "You're the one building the timeline," she said instead, flat, not quite an accusation. "I'm the one who catalogs salvage," Wren said. "Word travels faster than either description, apparently." Something that might have been the ghost of dry humor crossed the warden's broad face. "Word travels at the speed of a marshal who wants it to." She set down the seating chart she'd been holding, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the empty chapel deck echoing faintly around them. I passed the bowl straight across the gap, twice now. I imagine you logged both times in that flat hand of yours that doesn't let an opinion leak into the ink. I did. Do you think less of me for it? Wren considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. I think you're afraid of two different things at once, and I think you've been telling yourself they're the same thing because it's easier to be afraid of pain than to be afraid of a marshal who remembers who didn't fill a seat. She set her crate down, met the warden's eyes, which was not something she'd have dared do in her first week on the station, and had somehow stopped thinking of as dangerous somewhere in the last 5 days. I don't get to judge you for that, Warden. I've never had a collar that could feel a hollow note, and I've never had a household whose fortunes were bound to mine the way yours are bound to your name. It's easy to be brave about a cost you'll never actually have to pay. Ussa Dornvell was quiet a long moment, her collar cycling slow through amber toward something Wren didn't have a name for yet. My grandmother served the prime before Daskai's predecessor, she said finally. She used to say the Long Table's oldest law was written by people who trusted grief to be honest, and never imagined a season where fear would learn to wear grief's exact shape to get what it wanted. I have spent 6 days telling myself I was honoring that old law. I have spent 6 nights lying awake knowing I was actually just protecting my household standing, and calling it honor because the word sat easier. Her hand came up briefly, to rest against her own collar, over the ridged plates. I don't know if I'm capable of crossing that gap, clerk. I've asked myself every night this week, and I keep arriving at the same answer, which is that I don't know until the moment is actually in front of me and not a hypothetical one. Then don't decide it now, Wren said. Decide it when the bowl's actually in your hand. That's the only test that's ever going to be honest anyway. The warden looked at her for a long moment, the particular measuring look Wren had come to associate with every Vyark noble on this station who was trying to work out whether a human clerk was naive, dangerous, or simply the only person in the room willing to say a true thing out loud. You are either going to save this Concord a great deal of grief, clerk, she said finally, or you are going to cost it more than it can afford to lose. I find I cannot yet tell which, and I have made a career of being able to tell. She picked her seating chart back up, precise and formal again, the moment closing over itself the way Vyark courtesy always closed over moments that had gone somewhere too honest to sit comfortably in a public hall. Good evening, Kessler. She left, and Wren stood alone in the empty chapel deck a while longer, turning the warden's honesty over the way she turned everything over, and thought that whatever happened at the third table, she had at least learned that fear and cowardice were not, on this station or perhaps anywhere, quite the same thing wearing 2 different names. Building the timeline took 3 evenings, most of them stolen from sleep she told herself she'd make up later. Wren worked the way she always worked, methodically, without drama, cross-referencing the divorce shift logs against the guard detail manifests, against the fragments of Daskai's voice on the recorder, laying it all out on the archive office's work table in neat, overlapping columns until the shape of the final hour started to emerge from underneath the wreckage of everyone else's assumptions about it. The shift logs told her the lattice failure had started in a service conduit 2 decks below the primary evacuation route, not in the reactor core the rumor mill on Ilvath had settled on, a detail nobody outside engineering had ever bothered to check, because the rumor had already hardened into fact by the time anyone with the training to read a containment schematic thought to look. The guard detail manifest told her Ythera's personal escort had logged an unscheduled deviation from her evacuation route at almost the exact timestamp. The recorder captured Daskai's order, consistent, precisely, with a prime being physically redirected against her stated intention. And the passenger count on the last shuttle out, cross-referenced against the 211 names on the casualty list, told her something the recording alone hadn't. The shuttle Daskai held open for 2 extra minutes had carried out 43 more people than its rated capacity, 43 names that appeared nowhere on the casualty list at all, because they had lived. She sat with that number for a long time on the third evening, in the empty archive office, the working lights humming the way they always hummed. 43 people who had a Concord partner's last 2 minutes to thank for the rest of their lives, and not one word of public credit for the man who'd bought them, because a grief seal kept the only person who could have told the story from ever telling it. She thought of Mawson's dead physician, remembered for a single gesture and nothing else. She thought that history, left to its own devices, had a way of losing the wrong things. "Hollow note," Kessler said quietly, when Wren asked her about it that night in the archive office, the two of them the only ones left under the working lights. "It's real, Wren." That's the thing nobody on either side likes to say plainly. When a chorus bond is severed by death, the surviving half emits a resonant static grief with a frequency, more or less, and it aches in any bonded Vyerk's own collar organ if they stand too close for too long. It's not superstition dressed up as science. It's a genuine biological cost of standing beside her. That's what makes the shunning so hard to fight. Half of it is fear. Half of it is a courtier telling the truth about his own body. Then how is anyone supposed to sit with her? "Someone whose collar can't feel it," Kessler said, and looked at Wren with an expression Wren didn't like, because it looked like the beginning of a thought Kessler wasn't going to finish out loud. "Humans don't have a chorus organ. We wouldn't feel a thing." Wren sat with that for a long moment, the archive lights humming, the recorder from the Devore crate sitting dark and locked in its repair queue 3 shelves away. "Don't," Kessler said, reading her face with the ease of 40 years' practice. "Wren, our deputation's hole standing on this station is under review. Marshal Ilo told us to stay clear of the succession in plain words in a room full of witnesses. If you sit at that table, you're not filing a log entry anymore. You're an act, and acts get answered." "I know," Wren said, and meant it, and didn't stop thinking about the recorder anyway. Her first attempt at the recorder went nowhere. She caught the engineering shop's junior technician, a broad-faced Vyerk named Dissin who owed her a favor for backdating a supply request, in the 10 minutes before close, and he had it open on his bench inside of 2 minutes. Casing cracked, housing pried, contacts exposed under a jeweler's loupe. Before the readout gave them nothing but a flat red fault glyph and a whisper of dead static. "Corrosion in the primary cell," Dissin said, turning the unit over in 3-fingered hands. "Salt vapor damage, most likely, happens to units that get exposed to a breached environmental seal before they're recovered. I can bypass the primary, run it off an external cell instead, but it'll take me until tomorrow, and I'd be doing it after my actual shift, on my own bench time, for an archive apprentice who won't tell me what's actually on it. Would it help if I told you it might matter to more than just the manifest?" Dissin looked at her for a long moment, his own collar, young, still finding its steady adult color, a pale unformed green flickering with something that might have been curiosity or might have been simple tiredness weighing a favor against a night's sleep. "It would help," he said finally, "if you understood that I've got cousins on my mother's side who did contract work out of Devore before the collapse. I don't need to know what's on it to want to know what's on it. Come back tomorrow, second shift. And clerk, whatever it is, if it's the kind of thing Marshal Ilo's people would rather stayed broken, do the smart thing and don't tell me until after I've already fixed it." When she returned to the engineering shop the next evening, Dissin's bench light was already lit, and so was he, his young, unformed green collar cycling faster than she'd ever seen it, quick uneasy pulses instead of its usual slow drift. "You get a visit?" she asked, because there was no point pretending she hadn't clocked it the moment she stepped through the door. "2," Dissin said, not looking up from the bench, where the recorder sat with its casing already reopened, a thin cable running from an external cell into the housing. First one was polite. A junior logistics officer, official-looking credentials, asking whether I'd logged any off-manifest repair requests this cycle. I told him the truth. Every request I take goes through the queue, and this one hadn't yet because I hadn't started it, which was true when I said it and stopped being true about 4 minutes after he left. His collar pulsed, uneven. Second one wasn't an officer, didn't give a name, didn't show credentials at all. Just stood in the doorway of my own bench bay for exactly as long as it takes to make a point, and mentioned that he'd heard I had cousins who worked D4 contract, and hoped none of them were still waiting on a resettlement stipend that could get held up in processing over some irregularity or another. Wren felt something go very still and very cold in her chest. Sin. Don't, he said, and there was no anger in it, only the flat, tired honesty of someone who'd already run the calculation twice and arrived at the same answer both times. I know what you're going to say, that I don't have to finish this, that you'll find another tech or do it broken or wait. He finally looked up at her, his collar settling by visible effort into something steadier than it had been a moment before. My cousin's stipend cleared 11 months ago. There's no processing hold left to threaten anymore. Whoever sent that man either doesn't know that, or didn't care whether the threat was true, only whether it landed. Either way, clerk, it told me something worth knowing for free. Nobody sends an anonymous man to lean on an engineering tech over routine repair paperwork. Not unless the paperwork is a great deal less routine than it looks on the intake form. He turned the recorder over once more under the loop, checked a contact, and started closing the housing, and then both of them went still at the same instant, at the sound of boots in the corridor outside, unhurried, the particular cadence of a security patrol on its standard rounds rather than anyone hunting for anything in particular. Sin killed the bench light without a word. They stood in the sudden dark of the shop, the recorders read out the only glow in the room, until the boots passed the door without slowing and faded back down the corridor. Standard patrol, Sin said, when the sound was gone, though his collar hadn't fully believed it even as he said it. Same one every night, same time. I've worked this bench 3 years. I know the difference between somebody walking past and somebody walking toward. He didn't relight the bench lamp, worked the last of the housing shut by the readout's pale glow instead, as if the dark itself were now doing them a favor. I'm finishing it, he said, quieter now. Not because I'm brave, clerk. Because a man already spent real effort trying to talk me out of finding out what's on this thing, and that's not the kind of curiosity that goes back to sleep once it's been woken up on purpose. He held out the standard playback lead. Sit down. And when whatever this is finally happens, because something is clearly about to, you tell whoever writes the record, if anyone ever does, that Sin of Ilvath Anchorage finished the job scared and did it anyway. I'd rather that be true of me than the alternative. She sat, and Sin closed the shop's outer door without being asked, and gave her the room. The readout held steady, green instead of red, and she fed the standard playback lead into her own recording slate with hands that had gone, for just a moment, less than perfectly steady. Most of it was corrupted, routine shift chatter, a birthday greeting recorded for someone who would never hear it now, 3 minutes of nothing but static. But near the end, 7 minutes survived clean, timestamped to the final hour of the D4 lattice station, and Wren sat alone in the archive office with the volume low, and listened to a dead man's voice describe, in the flat, urgent shorthand of someone doing his job under a countdown, a containment lattice buckling faster than the evacuation could clear the lower decks. Prime Doskai's voice was in it too, twice, giving an order to hold the last shuttle for 2 more minutes of loading, and then, later, shorter, sharper, a command Wren had to replay 3 times to be sure she'd heard it right, telling his own guard detail to get the Prime off the platform, by force if she resisted, because she would not go on her own. The recording ended there. Whatever came after, the 211 names, the final failure of the lattice, the moment a Concord partner chose to stay and hold a dying station's evacuation route open with his own body between the failing field and the last shuttle bay, None of it had survived onto this particular recorder. But what was there was enough to turn the story Marshal Ilo had let grow in the dark on its head. Ythera hadn't fled. She'd had to be dragged. Wren copied the file twice, hid one copy where she was fairly sure nobody would think to look, and sat for a long time with her hands flat on the desk, feeling the exact shape of the 6 days she had left, and the exact shape of what Akafar had told her not to do. She went to the Prime's private study the next morning, ostensibly to deliver a routine log of the week's salvage intake, because that errand was real and gave her a reason to be standing in the doorway at all. Ythera's study was smaller than Wren had expected of a ruler. A narrow room lined with the same pale flowering vine from the garden alcove, growing wild along a support strut, its blooms closed tight this early in the station's artificial day. A single low chair sat angled toward the viewport instead of toward the door, and a second chair, matching it, stood pushed back against the far wall where it would never be seen from the doorway unless someone went looking. The kind of detail Wren catalogued without meaning to. The way she catalogued everything, and understood only a beat too late that she had just found the exact shape of what an empty seat looked like when nobody official was even watching to make it a statement. The Prime turned when Wren entered, and up close her gray collar looked worse than it had across a crowded hall. The ridges along it fine and delicate, built, Wren understood now, to hold and carry light and holding none. "Kessler," Ythera said, not unkindly. "Just precise, the way everyone precise on this station seemed to be. You're the one who logs my tables." "Yes, Prime." "Then you've written oath not renewed in your own hand twice now." It wasn't a question, and there was no self-pity in the way she said it, only the flat exhaustion of someone stating a fact she had already made peace with, or was trying very hard to convince herself she had. "You may as well know I don't blame the room, Kessler. A chorus severed by death is a wound in the body of every bonded Vyerk who stands near it. My court isn't cruel for keeping their distance. They're honest." "Some of them," Wren said, before she could stop herself, "aren't standing back because it hurts. They're standing back because Marshal Ilo is watching who doesn't." Something moved across Ythera's collar, not light. There was none left to move but a kind of stillness that was its own answer. "You're observant for an archivist." "I catalog what comes off dead stations for a living. You notice patterns." Wren glanced once toward the second chair against the far wall and did not comment on it, and saw from the small stillness that crossed Ythera's face that the Prime had noticed her noticing. "Daskai used to sit there, when you worked. He liked to watch me read reports upside down and correct my arithmetic without being asked," Ythera said, and there was nothing performed in the dry, worn fondness of it. "It is a small thing to miss, out of everything a Concord is supposed to be. I find I miss it more than the larger things some cycles. Grief does not always weight itself the way you expect it to." "Then notice this one too," Ythera said, and for the first time her voice had an edge in it, not anger, something closer to warning. "Whatever you think you understand about the collapse, whatever curiosity is sitting behind your eyes right now, set it down. My grief seal forbids me from testifying to my own conquered partner's death, even to save myself from the tribunal. It is not a rule I am permitted to break, and it is not a rule I would ask a stranger, still less a child from a deputation whose treaty status hangs by the same thread mine does, to break for me. If Marshal Ilo decides you are meddling in a Vyerk succession, he will not need to touch you at all. He will simply end your people's welcome here, and you will have cost your whole mission for nothing, because I cannot be saved by evidence I am forbidden to speak." "You're forbidden to speak it," Wren said carefully. "Nobody said anything about me." Ythera looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured something and did not immediately report what it found. "Go file your log, Kessler," she said finally, turning back to the viewport, "and go carefully." Wren went. She did not go carefully. She went straight to the archive office and started building a timeline. She found the young courtier 2 days later. not by design so much as by the simple persistence of a station small enough that anyone who wanted to find anyone eventually did. The courtier was off duty, sitting alone on a bench along the middeck promenade with a ration of pale tea going cold in her hands, and she looked up when Wren's shadow crossed her the way someone looks up who has spent the last several days flinching at every shadow that might belong to someone worse. "Clerk," she said, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders when she placed the face. "You're not usually down this deck. I wanted to ask you something, and I didn't want to do it where anyone official was standing close enough to overhear the answer." Wren sat on the far end of the bench, leaving a careful, deliberate distance, the kind she'd learned to leave with every Vyark she didn't yet know well enough to read. "You said, in the corridor, that some of you weren't standing back only because of the ache, that the two reasons had gotten tangled." The courtier's collar cycled, slow, from its resting amber toward something more guarded. "I remember what I said." "I'm not asking you to testify to anything," Wren said. "I'm asking because I keep meeting people on this station who know more than they're willing to say out loud, and I'm trying to understand whether that's fear of the ache, or fear of Marshal Ilo, or whether, like you told me, most of you can't actually tell the difference anymore. I think that matters. I think if nobody can tell the difference, that's exactly the kind of confusion a man like Ilo knows how to use." The courtier was quiet a long moment, turning her cooling tea in her hands. "My mother served 2 primes before Ythera," she said finally. "Neither of them ever lost a Concord partner to anything but old age, in a peaceful season, with the whole court gathered to grieve properly. I have never once in my life seen what a hollow note shunning actually looks like from the inside until this cycle. I don't know how much of what I feel when she walks past is real ache, and how much of it is my own body performing what 6 days of watching everyone else flinch has taught it to expect. I used to think that was a shameful thing to admit. I've started thinking it might just be an honest one." She glanced sideways at Wren. "You're the first person who's asked me the question like you actually wanted the true answer, instead of the useful one." "I catalog things for a living," Wren said. "Useful answers file wrong. I've learned to notice when something doesn't sit flush." Something that might have been the beginning of a real smile crossed the courtier's young face, there and gone. "I don't have a name I've given you yet," she said. "I've noticed that too. I think I've been keeping it back on purpose, in case whatever you're building goes wrong and I need to have been nobody in particular." She was quiet again, and then, as if she'd decided something mid-sentence, "It's Sale. Junior attendant to the Prime's own household, for whatever that's worth to a tribunal that doesn't count my rank as high enough to matter." "It matters to me," Wren said, and meant it. "Then I'll tell you the true answer, clerk, since you asked for it plainly instead of asking for the useful one." Sale set her cold tea down on the bench between them, untouched. "If the tribunal convenes and nobody has moved by then, I don't know if I'll be brave enough to be the first one across that gap. I've thought about it every night this week and I still don't know. But I know I'll be standing close enough to see who does. And I know that whoever it is, I won't be able to go on telling myself afterward that the ache was the only reason I never tried." She looked at Wren directly, something steadier in her collar now than there had been a minute before. "That's not bravery either, is it? That's just honesty arriving a little late." "Late's still early enough most days," Wren said, "if the debt hasn't come due yet." Sale didn't answer that, only picked her cold tea back up and drank it anyway, and the two of them sat on the bench a while longer without saying anything else, watching the promenade traffic pass in front of them the way two people watch whether they both know is coming and can't do anything yet to hurry or delay. Marshal Ilo found out 3 days later, which was, Wren would think afterward, almost exactly as long as it should have taken a man with eyes in every corridor on the anchorage. He didn't come to her directly. He came to Okafor in the archive wing in the middle of the working day, with 2 aides trailing him and a courtesy that had teeth in it. "Your apprentice," he said, has been requesting archived Devor Lattice Station engineering telemetry through a technician who is not authorized to release it to deputation personnel. I raise this not as an accusation, archivist. I raise it as a kindness before it becomes one. She's cataloging salvage, Kessler said. That's her post. Cataloging does not require cross-referencing containment field failure logs against Concord guard detail communications from the final hour of the collapse. Ilo's voice had not risen. It never rose. That was, Wren thought, watching from the archive stacks where she'd frozen mid-step, somehow worse than if it had. I told this deputation in front of witnesses to stay clear of a succession that is not theirs to referee. I am telling you again once, as a courtesy I do not owe you. The severance tribunal convenes in 3 days. Whatever your apprentice believes she has found, whatever comfort she believes she is offering a prime who cannot even thank her for it without breaking her own grief seal, it will change nothing. The law does not weigh evidence. It weighs seats. Empty ones at the third table end this. Nothing else will. He left without waiting for a reply, but at the doorway he paused and turned. And for the first time since Wren had arrived on Ilveth Anchorage, Marshal Wren Ilo looked directly at her instead of past her, as if he had known exactly where she was standing in the stacks the entire time and had simply chosen when to acknowledge it. Kessler, he said. It was the first time he had ever used her name. You are young, and I suspect you believe that makes what you're doing brave rather than merely unweighed. I have watched this Concord's law operate for 600 cycles longer than you have been alive, and I will tell you, as a courtesy your archivist has apparently declined to make plain enough. The law does not care how true your recording is. It cares how many seats are filled. You may be entirely correct about Devor and it will change nothing, and your deputation will still be gone within the season, and you will have spent your own standing on this station to purchase precisely nothing. I would rather you understood that now than discover it in front of a full hall. He inclined his silver head, the same precise, courteous angle he'd given the humans in the briefing room. Good evening, archivist, apprentice. He left, this time in earnest, and the sound of his footsteps down the corridor took a long time to fade. Kessler turned to look at her, and for a long moment said nothing at all. I'm not going to order you not to, Kessler said finally. I tried that once already, and you filed a repair request behind my back inside of 48 hours. So I'm going to tell you the actual stakes instead, plainly, the way I'd tell any officer under me. If you sit at that table in 3 days, and the tribunal decides a human clerk's presence doesn't count as a lawfully renewed oath, and it may well decide exactly that, because you are not Concord, Wren. You have no vote, no rank, no standing in their law at all, then Marshal Ilo wins anyway, and our whole deputation may be packing for home within the week, treaty or no treaty. I need you to understand that before you decide anything. I understand it, Wren said. Do you understand what happens to you personally if he decides you're a problem worth removing before you're a witness worth silencing? Wren thought of the courtier's collar flaring white in the corridor, the pain that had been real and involuntary and gone in 3 seconds. She thought of Ythera's flat, exhausted voice saying I cannot be saved by evidence I am forbidden to speak. She thought, oddly, of the dead engineer's voice on the recorder, calm under a countdown, doing his job because someone had to and there was nobody else in the room willing. I think, she said, that if I don't sit down nobody else is going to either, not because they don't want to. Because it costs them something real, and they've been told for 6 days that the cost is the whole point. And you think it costs you nothing. I think it costs me a job I like, Wren said. That's not nothing, it's just not the same as what it costs them. Kessler studied her for a long moment, and then did something Wren hadn't expected. She reached over, unlocked the drawer where the second copy of the recording sat, and slid it across the desk. Then you'll want this back, she said, before the third table, not to play, not yet, just to have. Marshal Ilo found her alone the following evening, which told her, when she thought about it afterward, that, Alone on this station was a condition he could arrange rather than one he'd simply happened upon. She was in the observation gallery above the cargo bay, off-duty, watching a resettlement shuttle complete its docking sequence through the thick viewport glass, when his reflection appeared in the glass beside her own, close enough that she understood he'd chosen the angle on purpose, so that she would see him arrive before she heard him. "You've been careful," he said, without preamble, in the same unhurried voice he used in briefings. "Careful enough that I have found very little to object to procedurally. That is either remarkable discipline in a 16-year-old apprentice, or remarkably good counsel from an archivist who has spent 40 years learning exactly how close to a line a person can stand without crossing it. Is there something you wanted, Marshal?" "I wanted to see your face when I told you something plainly, without a room to perform for," Ilo said. "You believe you are protecting a wronged woman from an unjust application of a fair law. I understand the shape of that belief. It is a comfortable one, and comfortable beliefs are the hardest to argue a person out of, because arguing against them makes the arguer sound cruel rather than merely correct." He turned from the glass to face her directly, silver plating, catching the gallery's low light. "I'm going to be cruel for exactly one sentence, Kessler, because I think you have earned the honesty more than you have earned the comfort. If you sit at that table and the tribunal rules against Ythera regardless, and it may, evidence or no evidence, because 600 cycles of law are not undone by one recording and one clerk's nerve, you will have spent everything you have. You're standing on this station, your deputation's treaty, possibly your own safety to lose. And you will have done it in public, in front of every noble who will remember, for the rest of your short human life, that you were the girl who gambled everything on a prime and came up empty-handed. And if I win?" Something flickered across Ilo's collar, gold shading briefly toward the wary amber she'd seen once before, in the archive wing. "If you win," he said, "you will have made an enemy of a 600-cycle institution that does not forget, wearing the body of a man who has already outlived 4 conquered successions and intends to outlive this one too. Winning, Kessler, is not the same thing as being safe. I would have thought a clerk who spends her days cataloging what's left after other people's catastrophes might understand that distinction better than most." "I catalog what's left," Wren said, "because somebody has to, or it gets forgotten twice, once when it happens, and once more when nobody bothers to write it down honestly. I don't think you're wrong about the cost, Marshal. I think you've decided the cost is a reason to do nothing, and I've decided it's a reason to hurry." For a long moment Ilo said nothing at all, and the shuttle below finished unloading in silence, running lights sweeping slow blue arcs across the cargo bay floor. "You remind me," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been in the briefing room or the archive wing, something almost, though not quite, like respect, "of a warden I served as a young aide, 400 cycles ago, who believed exactly what you believe now, that hurrying toward the truth was always braver than waiting for the safer version of it to arrive on its own. She was right, as it happens, more often than she was wrong. It did not make the cycles she was wrong any less costly for her, or for the people who had trusted her timing with their lives." He inclined his head, the same precise angle he offered everyone, friend or obstacle alike. "Good evening, Kessler. I hope, sincerely, that you turn out to be one of the cycles she was right." He left without waiting for a reply, and Wren stood at the viewport a long while after his footsteps had faded, watching the last of the cargo unload in the bay below, and found that his final sentence had unsettled her considerably more than any of his threats had, because, for the first time since she'd arrived on Ilvath anchorage, Marshal Wren Ilo had said something that hadn't sounded like a warning at all. It had sounded like he meant it. Elder Mawson found her in the archive office 2 evenings before the third table, letting himself in without knocking, the particular courtesy of an old Vyerk who had decided a young human's privacy mattered less than what he'd come to say. "You've built your case," he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her desk with the slow deliberateness of joints that had outlived several Concords. "I can see it in the way you're not sleeping. I recognize the look. I wore it myself once, 411 cycles ago, though I was considerably older than you are now and had a great deal less to lose. You were there for Corvath's third table. I was a junior scribe, half my current rank, assigned to log the proceedings exactly as you've been logging Ythera's." Mawson's ancient collar pulsed, slow, remembering. "I watched the physician cross that hall. I wrote down what he said, word for word, in the same flat hand you use, because that was my post, and I did not yet understand that some words deserve more than a flat hand." He was quiet a moment. "I have spent 400 cycles regretting that I did not write down more than the single sentence that made it into the permanent record. I did not write down that his hands shook the entire walk across the hall. I did not write down that he stopped once halfway, and I thought for a full 3 seconds that he had lost his nerve and would turn back. I did not write down what Corvath's face did when he sat. I wrote down the law's version of the moment, because I was young, and I thought the law's version was the important one. Why are you telling me this now? Because you are about to become the second line in a 411-cycle-old sentence, clerk, and I find I cannot let that happen again without at least warning you what the record keeps and what it throws away." He leaned forward, and for the first time since Wren had known him, something in his ancient bearing looked less like patience and more like urgency. "The record will keep the fact that you sat. It will keep the recording you played and the ruling that followed it, because those are the parts that changed the law's outcome. It will not keep the 2 nights you didn't sleep. It will not keep whatever it is you're not telling your archivist about a jacket hung wrong in your own quarters. Yes, clerk, I hear things too. This is a small station. It will not keep the fear, only the act, and I have watched 400 cycles of this station's history reduce brave people to single sentences, and I have never once found a way to stop it happening. I can only make sure that at least one person in this room tonight knows the whole shape of what it's costing you, before the record simplifies it down to a gesture." Wren considered that for a long moment. "Maybe that's enough," she said finally. "One person knowing the whole shape of it. Maybe the record was never going to be able to hold all of it anyway, and expecting it to is asking the wrong thing of a filing system." Something crossed Mawson's ancient collar that might have been surprise, or might have been the particular relief of an old man discovering that a lesson he'd carried alone for 4 centuries had finally landed somewhere it could be understood. "You catalog wrecked things for a living," he said. "I imagine you learned a long time ago that the file is never the object. It only ever points at where the object used to be." "Something like that. Then perhaps you'll forgive an old ritual keeper one more indulgence before you do whatever you're going to do in 2 days. He reached into his robe and drew out a small, worn token, a fragment of bronze, edge-smoothed by centuries of handling, stamped with a sigil Wren didn't recognize. This came off the original Concord bowl, the one Corvath's court used, replaced 3 cycles after her tribunal when the old bowl finally cracked beyond repair. I have kept this piece in my robe for 408 cycles, clerk, for reasons I have never fully explained to anyone, including myself. I find tonight that I finally understand why. I was keeping it for whoever came next." He set it on her desk, precise and unhurried. "Carry it if it helps. Leave it if it doesn't. Either way, know that the law was wrong once before, and a room full of frightened people eventually said so out loud, and the station did not end. It only, finally, told the truth." He left before she could find a way to thank him properly, and Wren sat alone with the small bronze fragment for a long time afterward, turning it over in her fingers the way she turned over everything, and did not, in the end, decide whether to carry it or leave it until the morning of the 3rd table itself. The night before the 3rd table, the station held its quarterly memorial for the Devore dead, a modest observance, held in a chapel deck too small for the number of names it was meant to honor, 211 of them scrolling in slow procession across a black display wall, while attendees stood in loose, unranked clusters that long table protocol never permitted anywhere else on the anchorage. Wren went because Akafra thought the deputation should be seen there, and stayed longer than she'd planned to, watching the names scroll past: engineers, contract crew, 3 whole families traveling together for a resettlement transfer that never completed, and watching, too, the particular way grief flattened rank on a night like this. Nobles and clerks and off-duty station staff standing shoulder to shoulder in a room too dim for anyone to be certain who was watching whom. She saw Elder Vashti there, a stooped, ancient Vyerk she recognized from the long table's farthest seats, a steward of the old court who had served 3 primes before Ythera and rarely spoke at all, standing near the display wall with her collar a slow morning blue, close enough to where Ythera stood alone at the room's edge that, for one held breath, Wren thought the old steward might actually cross the gap. Vashti's hand lifted, halfway, toward the empty space beside the prime, and Marshal Ilo, 3 steps away in conversation with another noble, did not so much as glance in their direction, did not need to, because the room itself had learned by now to police its own gaps without him lifting a finger. Vashti's hand came back down. She lowered her head to the display wall instead, murmured a name, and did not move again for the rest of the observance. Wren didn't approach either of them. It wasn't her place, not tonight, in a room built for a grief that belonged to 211 families, and not to the political argument riding on top of it. But she watched Ythera stand alone at the edge of a room mourning the same dead she mourned, unapproached even here, even in a space where rank was supposed to mean nothing, and she understood something she hadn't fully let herself understand until that moment. The shunning wasn't only happening at the long table. It had soaked into every room on this station where Ythera might otherwise have found a single hand to hold. She left the observance early, walked the long way back to the archive wing past the burn-scarred hull plating, and did not sleep well. She spent part of that sleepless night with the recording itself, not the salvaged original but the small, worn slate copy Akafra had returned to her, running the 7 clean minutes back one more time in the dark of her own quarters, not because she needed to hear it again, but because some part of her needed, one more time, to hear a dead man doing his job under a countdown, and not once asking anyone to notice how frightened he must have been. She thought about Sin closing his shop's outer door and giving her the room anyway. She thought about Tally's, walking a corridor a little slower for 2 weeks running, for no reason she was required to give. She thought about Sale's cold tea on a bench, and the warden's hand coming up to rest against her own collar in an empty chapel deck, and the pink-collared mother who had never once asked Wren for anything and had told her the truth regardless. None of them, she understood, lying awake with the recording static fading out for the last time that night, had needed her to be brave for them. They had each, in their own small, unglamorous way, already decided to be brave for themselves, and what she was about to do tomorrow was not going to be the thing that made any of that possible. It was only going to be the thing that finally gave the rest of them somewhere to stand. She thought, too, about what happened if it went wrong. If the tribunal ruled a clerk's hand on the bowl meant nothing, if Marshal Ilo's version of the law held after all, if the deputation packed for home within the season and 8 months of learning, this station's ozone and paper smell ended in a transport hold with everything she owned in one bag. She let herself feel the actual shape of that fear for a while, honestly, the way she tried to feel everything, instead of filing it away flat and unexamined the way she filed a damaged recorder. It was a real fear. It did not, in the end, weigh more than the alternative, a room that stayed silent because staying silent had once again turned out to be safer, and a woman at the head of an empty table who would go on being punished for surviving something that had never been her fault to begin with. She fell asleep sometime after that briefly, and dreamed of nothing she could remember, and woke to the sound of the station's artificial dawn cycling up through her quarter's single narrow window, and found that the fear was still there, exactly the size it had been the night before, and that she was getting up anyway, which she supposed was the only thing anyone had ever actually meant by the word she had spent 6 days chasing across this station without quite being able to define it. She was at her post an hour before the hall opened, log already loaded, stylus already sharp, doing the thing she always did when a shift felt too large for her. She counted. She counted the archive shelves she'd cataloged that season. She counted the days since the recorder had clicked open in her hands instead of staying dark like the two beside it. She counted the number of times in 8 months she had done something that wasn't strictly her post, and came up, honestly, with one. Kessler found her there, sharpening a stylus that didn't need sharpening. "You don't have to," Kessler said, not for the first time, though there was less fight in it than there had been 3 days ago. "Whatever you've built, whatever's on that slate, you could hand it to me. I could carry it into that hall instead. I have more standing to lose and less to prove." "You'd carry it," Wren agreed. "But you wouldn't sit down, not because you don't want to, because the hollow note would put you on the floor the same as it put that courtier on the floor, and everyone in that hall would watch it happen and call it proof the room was right to be afraid." She set the stylus down, finally, satisfied with an edge it hadn't needed in the first place. "It has to be someone the ache can't touch. That's not you. It's not Calder. It's me, or it's nobody, and I've had 6 days to get used to the idea that it's me." Kessler was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone recalculating a risk she'd already run the numbers on twice. "Then I'll be standing exactly where I always stand," she said finally. "At the wall with a log of my own, watching every second of it. If it goes wrong, Kessler, it will not go wrong alone." "I know," Wren said, and found, saying it, that she meant that too. The third long table filled the hall 3 times over. Word had gone through the anchorage the way it always did, faster than any official notice. This was the last table, the deciding one, and the severance tribunal's 3 officiators sat in a raised gallery along the east wall, where the audience benches usually stood empty, robed in the pale blue-gray that marked them as neither faction, sworn only to the law itself. Beyond them, further back, a second, unofficial gallery had assembled on its own initiative. Station staff, off-duty deputation personnel, a scattering of divorce survivors from the resettlement office, drawn by the same current of rumor that had drawn everyone else, standing because there were no benches left for them, and none of them seemed willing to leave before they knew how it ended. Wren scanned the crowd once, without meaning to look for her, and found the pink-collared woman from the cargo bay standing near the back wall, arms folded, face unreadable, and did not know what to make of the fact that she had come at all. Marshal sat in his customary place near the head of the table, and beside him, in a chair that had not existed at the last 2 tables, sat a younger Vyerk with an unlit collar of his own, new, unbonded, waiting, aspirant Kaldorn, present for the first time as if merely to observe, though everyone in the hall understood exactly what he was there to inherit. Warden Ussa Dornvell sat further down the table than her rank strictly required, close enough to the widened gap that Wren wondered, watching her take her seat with unusual care, whether the warden had spent the last 3 days arguing with herself about exactly how close she was willing to sit. Wren stood at her post along the east wall, log open, stylus steady in a hand that did not feel steady at all. The recording sat on a data slate tucked inside her jacket, its weight entirely out of proportion to its size. Prime Ythera came in last, as custom required, and took her seat at the head of the table. Both flanking chairs stood empty, and this time, Wren saw as the ritual keeper called the table to order, they were not simply unfilled. They had been removed 1 seat further down on either side, a small, precise, deliberate widening of the gap, so that even a moment of impulsive courage from the far end of the table would have to cross more open floor than before to reach her. Had thought of everything. Wren understood, watching it, that he had done this exact thing before, not this exact collapse, not this exact prime, but this shape of quiet, lawful, bloodless removal, enough times to know precisely how far to widen a gap before anyone dared jump it. The bowl began its circuit. Hand to hand, claw to claw, 40 places, the old breath-shaped words moving down the table like a tide going out. Wren watched it come closer to the head, watched Warden Dornvell take it, hold it a half-second longer than strictly necessary, her collar flickering amber uncertain, and then pass it straight across the widened gap, exactly as before, the ritual keeper's eyes tracking every hand with the flat patience of someone who had already written the ending. The bowl reached the last hand before the empty seats. It hovered there. Wren set down her stylus. She did not remember consciously deciding to move. She remembered the floor of the long hall under her boots, longer than it had ever looked from the wall, and the particular silence that fell as a human clerk in a plain deputation jacket walked past 40 seated nobles toward a chair that was not hers to sit in. She remembered Marshal Ilo's collar flaring a hard, startled gold. She remembered Kaeldorn half rising from his own seat before some instinct told him to sit back down. She remembered Ythera's face. Not shocked, not yet. Something closer to the stillness of a person watching a door open that she had long ago stopped believing anyone would walk through. 2 of Marshal Ilo's household guard peeled off from the wall as she crossed the floor, moving to intercept before she reached the widened gap. And for one lurching half-second Wren understood she had badly misjudged how far this room's silence extended past ritual and into force. "Clerk," the nearer guard said, low, more warning than command, a broad hand lifting not quite to touch her but close enough that the threat of it did the work touching would have. "This is not a seat for. She is deputation personnel understanding Concord treaty protection." Akafar's voice cut across the hall from the east wall, flat and carrying. The voice of a woman who had spent 40 years learning exactly how loud a sentence needed to be to stop a room without shouting. "Lay a hand on her in this chamber, and you will have given the human coalition its first legitimate grievance against this Concord in a decade. I would think carefully, Marshal, before your household decides that is the incident it wants its name attached to." The guard's hand didn't fall so much as it simply, slowly, failed to finish rising. His eyes cut, for the barest instant, toward Marshal Ilo, and Ilo, seated, hands folded, said nothing at all, gave no signal Wren could see, and the guard stepped back half a pace, enough to clear a path that hadn't technically been blocked in the first place, enough for everyone in the hall to understand that whatever had almost happened had been allowed to unhappen rather than admitted to. Wren's heart was going hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and she made herself keep walking at the same unhurried pace, because she understood, with the same flat clarity she brought to cataloging a wrecked recorder, that the entire remaining shape of this night depended on nobody in this hall ever seeing her hurry. Wren pulled out the flanking chair and sat down. Nothing happened to her. That was the first thing she understood sitting there, the absence of the thing everyone in this hall had spent 4 months flinching from. No ache, no static, no pain climbing up a collar organ she didn't have. She felt only the ordinary cold of a chair that had been sitting empty in a climate-controlled hall, and the ordinary thud of her own human heart, and the extraordinary silence of 80 Vyark eyes fixed on her at once. She had expected some small, honest part of her to feel something, a chill, a weight, some proof that she was sitting in a place built to punish presence. There was nothing. Just a chair, and a table, and a woman beside her whose grief had been treated for 6 days like a communicable thing. And Wren understood, in the space of that ordinary, undramatic nothing, exactly how much of the last 6 days had been built on a fear nobody in this hall had ever actually tested against a body that couldn't feel it. The bowl was still in the last noble's hands, hovering over the gap. Wren reached across and took it. She dipped 2 fingers into the grain paste, the way she'd watched 40 nobles do it across 2 tables she'd only ever logged, never joined and ate, a plain, unglamorous, faintly bitter mouthful of food that meant, in a language older than the room's silence, "I renew this." Then she turned and held the bowl out, not toward the ritual keeper to continue its circuit, but toward Prime Ythera, close enough to set gently into her hands. Ythera did not move for one full second. That felt, to Wren, like the longest second of her life. Then the Prime's hands came up, steady, precise. The same hands that had rested folded on the cloth through 2 entire tables of silence, and closed around the bowl, and lifted a portion to her mouth, and ate. Her collar did not light. It couldn't. That was not how a chorus worked, not something restored by a single meal shared with someone who had no bond to offer in the first place. But something in her posture changed, some fraction of the weight she had been carrying upright through 2 humiliations easing, just slightly, in her spine. "This is not lawful," Marshal said. His voice, for the first time since Wren had arrived on the station, had an edge in it. "The oath is a conquered right. This clerk is not conquered. She holds no rank, no bond, no standing under our law. Her hand on that bowl renews nothing." "She sat," said a voice from further down the table, quiet, almost surprised at itself. Warden Dornvell had risen halfway out of her own chair, her collar cycling amber to gold to something Wren didn't have a name for. "Marshal, she sat where none of us would, and nothing touched her. Nothing could. She has no chorus to wound." The warden's eyes moved from the empty second chair beside the Prime to Ilo's face and did not look away. "I have a chorus. I have used it for 6 days as a reason to leave my Prime sitting alone at her own table, and I told myself it was the ache that stopped me. It was not only the ache, Marshal. You know it was not only the ache." She crossed the widened gap and sat down in the second flanking chair. The hall did not erupt. Vire custom did not permit eruption. But Wren, watching from a foot away, saw something ripple down the table anyway. A dozen collars shifting color in the space of 10 seconds. Uncertain, some of them. Still amber, still afraid. But no longer only afraid, because the shape of the fear had changed the instant it stopped being the only acceptable excuse in the room. Near the foot of the table, the same slight, younger aide who had cleared his throat in the briefing room and been silenced by 9 polite sentences rose halfway out of his own seat, looked at Warden Dornvell, his own household's ranking noble, sitting now beside a Prime whose flank he had watched stand empty for 3 tables, and sat back down twice before finally, on the 3rd try, staying standing. He did not cross to the head of the table. He was too junior, his rank too far down the order, for that seat to be his to claim even now. But he set his own untouched portion of the bowl down where he stood and said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, "I told myself it was the ache," in a voice that shook only slightly, and Wren understood that he was not confessing to the hall. He was confessing to himself, out loud, because it turned out to be easier to be honest in front of 80 witnesses than alone. Near the back of the unofficial gallery, Wren caught a flicker of movement that had nothing to do with the table itself. Sail, off her official duties for the evening, pressed close to the rail with both hands white-knuckled around it, her collar cycling fast between amber and something steadier, watching the warden cross the gap with an expression Wren recognized immediately, because she'd seen its opening version on a promenade bench 4 days before. Sail didn't move from the gallery. She wasn't ranked to approach the table, and no one expected her to. But when the aide's voice cracked out, "I told myself it was the ache," into the silence, Wren watched Sail's collar settle, all at once, into a steady, resolved gold. Not because the ache had stopped being real, but because she had finally, in front of a hall that would never learn her name, stopped pretending it was the only true thing she had been afraid of. Ilo's gaze cut to the aide sharp, and the aide did not sit back down. "This changes nothing under law," Ilo said, sharper now, and Wren understood she was watching a man feel the floor move under a plan he had spent months building. A clerk's meal and one warden's second thoughts do not answer the question this tribunal was convened to settle. The question of what happened at Devor remains unanswered, and unanswered, it remains grounds for. "It doesn't remain unanswered," Wren said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, into a hall gone very quiet, and she understood distantly that this was the part Akafar had warned her about, the part where sitting stopped being enough and speaking began, the part with no vote and no rank behind it. But she wasn't giving a speech. She reached into her jacket, drew out the data slate, and set it on the table beside the bowl, in plain sight of the raised gallery where the 3 tribunal officiators sat watching in their pale blue-gray robes. "There's a recording," she said, "recovered from Devor Salvage, Engineering Channel, final hour of the collapse. I'm not Concord. I don't get a vote on what happens next, but your law weighs seats, not evidence, that's what I was told. It doesn't say evidence can't be heard. I'd ask the tribunal to hear it before it decides how many seats are empty." The senior officiator in the gallery, an old Vyerk with a collar the deep, banked blue Wren had learned meant not grief but judgment held carefully in check, inclined her head a fraction. "The law does not forbid evidence," she said. "It has simply, in 600 cycles, rarely been offered when it mattered. Play it." Wren's hand shook, only slightly setting the slate to broadcast. The hall heard it exactly as she had Doskai's clipped, urgent voice holding the last shuttle 2 minutes longer, the engineer's flat countdown as the lattice buckled faster than the evacuation could clear, and then the order, short and sharp, cutting through the static: "Get the prime off the platform. By force if she resists." Nobody in the long hall moved. Wren watched Ythera's hands, still wrapped around the bowl, go very still. The recording ended in the same 7 seconds of clean static it always ended in. Into the silence after it, Wren said the only thing she'd let herself plan in advance, because it wasn't a speech, it was a fact, and facts were the only thing she had standing to offer this room. She didn't leave him. He had her carried off the platform so she couldn't stay and die with him. That's not a prime who abandoned her Concord to seize a throne alone. That's a prime who was dragged away from the one place she wanted to be, and has spent every day since being blamed for surviving it. For a long moment, nobody in the long hall said anything at all. Then the senior officiator rose from the gallery, slow and formal, and the sound of her robes was the loudest thing in the room. "Marshal Wren Ilo," she said, "you have sat this Concord succession law for 600 cycles longer than this apprentice has been alive. You knew a grief seal forbids a prime from offering her own account. You knew, therefore, precisely how much silence that seal would buy a story built to fill it. Did you know the contents of Devor's final hour before this cycle, or did you not?" Ilo's collar, for the first time since Wren had ever seen him, dimmed, not to gray, not to the prime's colorless ash, but to a wary, calculating amber that told her everything the man himself would never say aloud. "I knew," he said finally, each word costing him something, "that a story left unanswered would settle the succession faster than a truth no one was permitted to speak. I did not manufacture the silence, officiator. I merely declined to disturb it." "That," said the officiator, "is the same offense with better manners." She looked down the length of the table at the widened gap now half filled, at Warden Ussa Dornvell sitting where fear had kept her from sitting for 6 days, at 3 more nobles further down already rising from their own seats, hesitant, then less hesitant, crossing the floor toward chairs that had never before this hour held anyone at all. The severance tribunal finds no lawful ground to convene. The oath stands renewed. The Concord seat stands held. Her gaze moved last to Wren, standing beside the prime's chair with an empty data slate still in her hand. "And this tribunal notes, for the permanent record, that the seat beside a prime was filled tonight by someone this Concord's own law does not recognize as capable of filling it, and that the law was wrong to think so." The hall took a long time to empty. Wren stood at the edge of it afterward, back at her post out of habit more than duty, watching nobles she'd only ever seen from across a widening gap now crossing the floor in 2s and 3s to speak to a prime whose collar, though still unlit, no longer sat quite so much like a lamp nobody meant to relight. Aspirant Kaeldorn left early, quietly, his own collar dimmed to nothing, and nobody stopped him. Marshal left last, his silver plating catching the hall's cold light one final time in the doorway, and did not look back. Elder Mawson found her near the wall before the prime did, the old ritual keeper's banked blue collar carrying something that on a human face would have been the ghost of a smile. 411 cycles, he said, and now 2. He inclined his head courteously at the empty data slate still in her hand. History will not remember your name past this single act either, clerk, if the pattern holds. I find, having watched you catalog other people's disasters for 8 months, without once complaining that nobody remembered the people in them, that you may not mind that as much as the physician did. I don't need the record to remember me, Wren said. I need it to remember what actually happened at Devor. Those aren't the same thing. No, Mawson agreed. They rarely are. That clerk is the whole of what I have learned in 400 cycles of keeping this station's history, and you appear to have learned it considerably faster. He left her his second scroll, the full severance law, the one he'd pressed into her hands days before with a small, deliberate nod, as if to say, keep it now. You've earned the reading. The pink-collared woman from the cargo bay did not approach her, but Wren saw her, once, near the back of the thinning crowd, watching Ythera accept a portion of the bowl from a third noble's hand, with an expression that had not softened into forgiveness. Grief did not work that fast, for anyone, human or Vyark, but had shifted slightly into something closer to a question than an accusation. It was not resolution. Wren understood, watching her go, that it wasn't supposed to be. Some debts Devor had left behind weren't hers to clear, and never would be, no matter how many chairs got filled at any table. Ythera found her there near the wall, log closed, stylus finally still. You were told plainly twice, the prime said, to set this down. I was. And you didn't. No, Wren said. I filed a repair request instead. Something moved across Ythera's face that on a human would have been the beginning of a laugh, and on a Vyark without a working collar to carry, it was only a small, tired warmth around the eyes. My grief seal still forbids me from thanking you for the truth of what happened at Devor, she said. It will forbid it for the rest of my rule, most likely. I cannot testify to my own Concord partner's death, even now, even cleared of it. That is the cost of the seal, and no tribunal ruling unmakes it. You don't have to thank me for the recording, Wren said. I didn't sit down because of the recording. Then why? Wren thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, flat and exact, no opinion dressed up as more than it was. Because the chair was empty, she said, and I was close enough to fill it, and nothing about my body was going to make it cost me what it cost everyone else in that room. That's not bravery, Prime. That's just an accident of biology that happened to land on the one day it mattered. It is not an accident that you chose to use it, Ythera said. Everyone in this hall who might have sat beside me without pain chose, for 6 days, not 2. You are the only one who did. Wren didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't try to make one up. She only nodded and picked her log back up, and let the silence between them sit there without hurrying to fill it, because she had learned, in 8 months of cataloging what came off dead stations, that some silences didn't need filling. They only needed someone willing to sit inside them until they stopped being empty. Ythera was waiting by the archive wing doors when Wren finally walked back through them, arms crossed, expression unreadable in the way it only ever was when she was choosing, very deliberately, not to look as relieved as she felt. Deputation's treaty status is going to survive the week, I think, Ythera said, for what that's worth. For what it's worth, Wren agreed. I still have a repair queue to finish. She went back to her post the next morning, and the morning after that, and catalogued the rest of the Devor crates the same flat, exact way she catalogued everything, recorder, damaged, unresponsive, recorder, damaged, unresponsive, until she reached the bottom of the last one and found nothing left to tag. 6 days later, at the first long table of the new cycle, She was not seated along the east wall with her log at all. There was a chair for her now, small and plain, and a full arm's length down the table from where Concord custom actually required a warden's rank to sit. A compromise nobody had fully written into law yet, and nobody, watching the bowl come down the table and reach the prime's hand without hesitation for the first time in months, seemed inclined to argue with. Ythera's collar had not relit. It never fully would. Some lights, once gone, only ever came back dim if they came back at all, and the prime carried that the way she carried everything, upright and unhurried and without asking anyone in the room to look away from it. But when the bowl reached her that first morning, 3 separate hands reached to help pass it, us Adornvels among them, and none of them so much as flinched. Elder Vashti was one of the 3. She had crossed the hall that morning without hesitating at all, taken her old seat 2 places further up the table than she'd occupied in cycles, and when the bowl passed through her hands on its way to the prime, her ancient collar flickered a morning blue that had, for the first time since Wren had seen her at the memorial, something steadier underneath it. She did not explain herself to anyone, and no one asked her to. Some debts, Wren was beginning to understand, only needed a second chance to be visible in order to get paid. Wren logged it anyway out of habit in the flat clean hand she used for everything that mattered. Bowl reached the prime. Oath renewed. Then, because the old line finally felt insufficient for what she'd actually watched happen, she added one more, and did not cross it out. Nobody asked to be excused from sitting beside her this time. Desin came by the archive office 3 days after the 3rd table, ostensibly to collect a routine supply chit, and stood in the doorway a moment too long before he actually said anything. "Cousin got a message through," he said finally. "Resettlement processing cleared her stipend renewal without a single flag on it. No irregularity noted. Nothing held up." His collar, Wren noticed, had steadied since she'd last seen it, not fully settled into its adult color yet, but no longer cycling the uneasy quick pulses of that second evening in his bench bay. "I didn't tell her why I was asking. Didn't want her carrying a fear that turned out to be nothing." He set the chit down on her desk with more care than a routine chit required. "For what it's worth, clerk, I've decided a man who does his job scared and does it anyway probably doesn't need the record to remember him either. But I'm glad somebody wrote it down this time regardless." He left before she could find an answer for that, and Wren filed the chit in the ordinary queue, and did not, this time, add anything to the line beneath it. The pink-collared woman from the cargo bay found her a month later, not at a long table or a memorial, but in the resettlement office itself, where Wren had gone to deliver a routine transfer manifest. The woman's collar had settled some since the memorial, still raw at the edges, still a long way from any steady adult color, but no longer the open wound it had been in the cargo bay that first day. "I heard the recording," she said without preamble the way she'd said everything else. "Officially this time, read into the tribunal transcript, available to any family of the dead who asked for it," I asked. She was quiet a moment, arms still crossed the same defensive way they'd been crossed the day Wren met her. "It doesn't give me my daughter back. I want to be plain about that, clerk, in case you were hoping it would. Nothing you did fixes the fact that her birth never got a shuttle." "I wasn't hoping that," Wren said. "I don't think anything fixes that." "No," the woman agreed. "It means when I tell people how she died, I'm not also carrying the weight of everyone assuming her prime let it happen out of cowardice. That's a smaller thing than getting her back. It is still a thing." She didn't offer thanks exactly, Wren understood, watching her go, that thanks wasn't a shape this particular grief was ever going to take, but she inclined her head once, the small formal Vyerk gesture of a debt acknowledged if not fully paid, and left the resettlement office without looking back. Calder caught the story second-hand, the way most of the station had, and cornered Wren in the corridor outside the archive wing 2 days after the 3rd table with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something like a man recalculating an old, comfortable certainty. 11 years of coalition postings, he said, and I've never once seen a severance tribunal reverse itself. I looked it up. 411 years, Kessler, and you're the second name in the record. I know. I told you in this same corridor that the safe thing was to do nothing, and that safe and right weren't always the same animal. He shook his head, something rueful and warm in it. I don't think I fully believed, saying it, that anyone actually got to choose right and walk away standing. I've buried too many colleagues who chose right and didn't. He studied her a moment. You're going to have a strange career, Kessler. I mean that as a compliment mostly. People are going to spend the next 40 years deciding whether you're the exception or the beginning of a pattern, and I don't think you get to decide which one it turns out to be. I just wanted to be the one who told you that before the rumor mill got to it first. Good to know, Wren said and meant it, and went back to her post. Warden Ussa Dornvell sent no message and made no public statement. In the weeks that followed, about the chapel deck conversation nobody else had witnessed. But Wren noticed, cataloging the routine minutes of the first several post-tribunal long tables as part of her ordinary duties, that the warden's household aide, the same slight, younger noble who had risen twice and sat back down before finally staying standing, had been quietly promoted 2 ranks within his own household inside a single month, an advancement with no formal citation attached to it at all. The kind of thing that happened, Wren was coming to understand. When a noble wanted to reward an honesty, she couldn't yet bring herself to name in front of a full hall. 6 months later, when the deputation's treaty status came up for its scheduled review, it passed without incident, folded into a docket of routine renewals between a fishing rights clause and a customs agreement, exactly the kind of unremarkable outcome Akaffer had spent a career hoping for and rarely getting. Wren read the notice in the archive office on an ordinary 6th day, filed it, and went back to the day's intake. A new manifest, unrelated to D-Vor, ordinary cargo from an ordinary supply run, nothing in it that needed sorting into a queue nobody would ever look at again. Ilvath Anchorage had a great many empty seats still, at a great many tables she didn't sit at. But the one she'd sat at once no longer stood empty, and some cycles, watching a bowl pass hand to hand without a single hesitation in it, she thought that was as much of a fixed thing as this station, or this Concord, or this particular grief, was ever going to allow anyone.